We're not against development, but not at the expense of our waters and our lands.
Prime Minister Carney sat down with some First Nations leaders to discuss Bill C-5. I don't believe it went anywhere near the way he thought it was going to. Welcome back to the Canadian Shield. My name is Sterling. Mark Carney and a couple of Liberal ministers sat down with some chiefs from the First Nations of the Cree Nation, roughly from Manitoba to Alberta. Those were the ones that were represented in the press release that I saw. There was not a lot of love for the federal government coming out of these individuals, though they did say some things that were positive. I think that the way that it was tempered and the way that they were addressing it kind of indicates to me that there is a lot of ground yet to cover. Of course, that's going to set Mark Carney's agenda back, because in his mind, he's going to be able to say that he's doing one thing and all of the country is going to celebrate him and all of the country is going to carry him around on their shoulders. There's poverty from coast to coast because of this, because of the leadership of the Liberal Party. And from what I gathered, just listening, and you'll hear, though some of them seem open to it, they're not in a big rush. They want to make sure that all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, which of course is only making matters worse for the Liberal government, because with every passing day, as we get through the summer and come into the fall, it's going to be one of the worst economic falls that Canada has experienced in my lifetime. It'll be the 80s all over again. And if you weren't around for them, it was lean times, I can assure you. I'm going to let you hear a couple of things, but first I want you to listen to Mark Carney, who gets up on stage like thinking he's going to be Mr. Charming Pants and says one of the most pompous things I imagine you could ever hear. Perhaps it's not, maybe I'm being overly critical, but it certainly was tone deaf, which I think is the theme of the Liberal Party, isn't it? They're just tone deaf.
I'm going to say a few words and then I'm going to listen for the day. And the emphasis on listening, Ishkode. We are here to listen.
Well, there you have it, various members of the Cree First Nations. Mark Carney learned the word for listen. I'm going to assume that's what it is. And now that'll make up for all of the grievances that you have, even with just the modern day Liberal Party. Right? I mean, that'll make up for all of the monies that the Liberal government gave to non-First Nations industry and non-First Nations businesses, money that was supposed to be given to First Nations businesses to help, revitalize that economy. That'll make up for all of the times that the Liberal government told you one thing and did another. That'll make up for the poisoned water that the Liberal government has been promising you now for 10 years they're going to get to sooner or later. You heard Mark Carney. He's going to listen. I believe that Mark Carney should have chose his words a little wiser. I think that he sat down and got advice from somebody who might have a little bit of training in social worker. And they sat down and they said, oh, well, really what they want to be is heard. And it's an odd thing for people to think when you consider how many times I've seen the Liberal government answer a question by saying, well, I just said that. So if one reporter asks you a question and then you have to answer the same question to another group of people, it obviously irks you. So you can appreciate that the First Nations bands in this particular collection of them have said all of this before. And why would it not irk them to have to repeat themselves? Why did you not come prepared to understand what their grievances are already? Why did you not come prepared with at least a list of things? Let them know that you had been listening up to now. Let them know that the Liberal Party has already understood many of the grievances that are being felt by this particular collection of First Nations. Because as far as I can see, it was just essentially in the three, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. There are many other First Nations bands, but I believe that these ones came together because the pipeline is discussing going from Alberta to Manitoba to Churchill, and I hold to it. Not only should it be a pipeline, it should be a magnetic levitation, and it should be a deep water port. From that, then we can turn Churchill into a major center, and they can spiderweb out across the top using Churchill as the anchor. I've covered that, and I don't want to get too far into that in this video. I just wanted to make you see that the Liberal government came in a very condescending tone, talking to them like they wanted, they just wanted to be heard. They just want to feel like they're being heard. They want to feel that you're doing something. They want results. Nothing else is going to alleviate the concerns. Nothing else is going to make up for everything from the dirty water to the residential schools, which I'll again leave out of this. I have my own opinions on these matters. However, what I can tell you for certain is that talk is not what they're interested in. Results is what they're interested in. In fact, I would go so far as to say results is what all Canadians are interested in. And if your base is only interested in talk, then I think you guys should just sit down in one big room and talk to one another while the rest of us get things taken care of. And that includes the people from the First Nations. All right, we'll go into some of the, there was four of them, four chiefs that spoke that I wanted to give you samples of, because it's sort of a good snapshot of the temperature that I think indicates this C5 is in a lot of trouble.
First Nations of Prince Albert Land Council raising the alarm of Bill C5, where that legislation represents a direct threat to Indigenous sovereignty. And we need to move from silence to strategy, and that has to start now. And one of our senators, Senator Charles Whitecap, underscored the need to focus inward and rebuild foundational systems. To implement the treaty and treaty rights, we must first focus on who we are as nations, our identity, language, governance, laws, and we can't keep reacting to legislation that was never meant for us. And we must build our own systems and implementation and a nation-to-nation relationship. That the treaties were not land sales, but agreements to share the land. And that he said, we never surrendered our title to the land and resources. And we were never defeated, he said, Senator Burns. There has to be revenue sharing. There has to be. A lot of these, what the discussion was, how they presented their legislation, their law, Bill C5, it sounds so good, but I think it supports capitalism, and people will get rich, other people, there will be jobs, and hopefully those partnerships are there. But if not, if the partnerships are there has to be revenue sharing.
The lady that you heard do the intro, she was the chief of the Association of Manitoba Chiefs. That individual represented a group from Prince Albert, which is in Saskatchewan. And you'll find that the other two speakers that I'm going to show you, one comes from Alberta, one comes from another part of Manitoba. And you have to see that as part of a concern, because the Liberal government, the mainstream media, in their ignorance, in their lack of comprehension, tries to lump all of the First Nations peoples together, believing that they're all going to just follow along and do what other parts of the First Nations are going to believe in, right? Like, so if the chief of the Assembly of First Nations says, okay, we're doing it, in the mind of the Liberal cabinet member, or in the mind of Mark Carney, they believe the rest of them will all fall in line, because that's the way the left believes, right? They think that because Carney says it, we should all just buckle under, or because Trudeau said it, we should all just buckle under. I mean, you hear them all the time. Well, so-and-so said it and they got a university degree. And I'm like, I don't care. For centuries, people believed the world was flat. They were wrong, even the educated ones. So aside from that, though, the First Nations doesn't function that way. They're not going to go for it just because another individual or another band member has agreed to it. So you have to consider that is a negotiation that is not being addressed by the Liberal government, right? They want one-on-one talks. Doesn't matter that there's 300 of them or 100 of them or however many bands it touches to get this particular pipeline to Churchill, and however many bands or because now when you get up into Churchill, you're getting into Inuit territory, so you have a different sort of cultural expectation. I don't believe the Liberal government understands any of that. However, what this gentleman did say, which I found to be very encouraging, was that he was hoping that there was revenue. Now, you heard him say a bunch of things that could be considered red flags, but then he finished it by saying that he believes it is going to be capitalism and it's going to get a lot of people wealthy. Now, what he said, and then he said, if that's not going to happen, at least let's have revenue sharing. And what he meant by that was people out of the bands getting jobs. Of course, that's the smoothest way to make this happen. And I have to be honest with you. That's the appropriate thing to do. I get that that might make a Texas oil man or a driller have his whole butt pucker. But if you found oil on my land, you would cut me in. That would be the first thing you'd say. You'd say, here's a big giant check. I'm going to take the oil out of your land. Don't worry about it. I'm going to cut you a check every couple of months. Everybody's going to be happy, hunky-dory. If I owned the land and you found gold on it, if I owned the land and you found, it doesn't matter what it is. So this is just appropriate. Of course, if you negotiate with each individual band for their mineral rights or for their other things, that's one thing. Paying them a fee to run a pipeline underneath the ground, well, I think that can be dealt with by simply hiring local excavators, right? To just have whoever's got a couple of tractors and maybe 3 or 4 other guys that want work to be there, give them a job, everything will be hunky-dory as it pertains to the pipeline, not as it pertains to the gold and the nickel and the zinc and the copper and the other products that are in the ground along the way. And I believe that the First Nations indicate that they are prepared to have that discussion. They don't want their water dirty. Nobody wants their water dirty. However, let's listen to a couple of more things before I encapsulate what all of them have to say. I just wanted to point out that when he said capitalism and people are going to get rich, what he meant was people in his band who have equipment and who are willing to work are going to get paid. I believe that it should be a combination of both because that's the right thing to do.
There is an abundance of hopelessness and despair in First Nations communities because we don't live in a third world. Let's get this straight. First Nations people in Canada, a G7 country, live in the fourth world. And it's unacceptable. And once again, it's indicative of the unhealthy and abusive relationship that we seem to be stuck in. I'll give you 2 quick examples of major destruction that has occurred in my ancestral territory of northern Manitoba, not just the Niitsitapi Cree Nation, but other First Nations and communities in northern Manitoba. One, perhaps the most damning, was Manitoba Hydro's Churchill River diversion. It flooded the community of South Indian Lake 10 feet underwater. To this day, the sturgeon are facing extinction. The whitefish are in danger of extinction. And a people that were once completely self-sufficient, proud, hard-working individuals who did not rely on the government for anything, including my late grandfather. That has been relegated to a community that is almost entirely reliant on the government for not just transfer payments, but employment income assistance or welfare. Welfare, social assistance, handouts, whatever you want to call it. We never needed this. And it's national projects of interest, like hydro dams and pipelines and mines, that have brought us to this place where we need to rely on the government in order to survive. The second example is the Rutan mine in Leaf Rapids, Manitoba. Many of my relatives and my citizens live in Leaf Rapids. The entire town is evacuated right now while the province and the feds kind of go back and forth over jurisdiction. There is no elected government, which is very convenient, and the people are not being helped. The town itself is in grave danger. An emergency mandatory evacuation took place recently. The people are all displaced, they're suffering. on the streets of Winnipeg, Brandon, Portage la Prairie, wherever. And this community has been on a boiled water advisory for over 20 years because this mine came in under the authorization not of matriarchs like myself, not of First Nations leadership, but by the authority of the provincial government, thanks to the National Resource Transfer Act. They came in, they destroyed, and they left a big mess and more tailings than you can shake a stick at.
I mean, you don't got to be a genius to see that she's angry, right? You don't need to have copious amounts of experience to understand that. She's very angry. She was very controlled of her anger. I'll give her that. Now, I looked up this mine. It's a mere 1,000 kilometers north of Winnipeg. 1,000 kilometers. And they took out 55 million tons of copper and poisoned the water. But they went in 1973 when we still thought that giving kids cigarettes was going to cure their cold. Now, I also have, I'm doing investigations into how we can clean up the tailings. Now, for those of you that don't understand the term, there's a lot of processes, whether it be aluminum, it doesn't matter what it is, there's always stuff that's left over, stuff that can't be used or stuff that is a byproduct of the process. And it's not good for sale. It's not any of that stuff. And it becomes left over. So it's a tailing. And they always make a little land, like a little lake for it, really. And they pour it in there. And, hopefully it doesn't leak and it doesn't leach and it doesn't do all of those kinds of things. But there are reclamation projects that can clean it up. And I think that that's something that we need to consider as part of this C5 that the Liberal government, of course, didn't cover because they just want to have control over whether or not Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan get together and build a pipeline. Of course, Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan would be better off to include the First Nations than they would be to include the Liberal Party. I suppose that's a different video. And certainly, I don't need, Danielle Smith and Scott Moe and Wab Canoe don't need me to tell them that. However, there should be something. If we're going to make everybody live in a tiny little apartment building and cram everybody together because we're afraid that carbon, a product that plants eat by that's their main source of nourishment. Why are we not worried about cleaning up the tailings? Why are we not worried about cleaning up the water? And then they'll say, well, who's going to pay for that? I don't really care. I would much rather pay for that than tell myself I got to buy an electric car. You can be sure of that. That at least will stimulate the economy. That at least will give people training. We can take people off of that ban, give them the wherewithal of what to do, put somebody over top of them that tells them how to, the manager, director, whatever it may be, and clean up that water, clean up those tailings. And that will go a long way. See, they don't want to listen. They want results. They have a list of grievances that they've been talking about for 20 years. And the Liberal Party walks in there with their condescending tone talking about how, well, we're here to listen. And that's going to somehow make everybody in the First Nations think that it's all good now. It's all changed. I believe that if you'd have come in with a plan to clean up the water, you probably would have gotten a lot further. And if I had to pick between the two, I would much rather clean up the water than worry about the carbon. Because sturgeon, whitefish, water advisory, these are standard of living things. On a reservation that was their property, you came in without their permission, dirtied up everything, now nobody lives there. That's something that we should be addressing. That's something we should be looking at and getting out in front of that for the next time, making sure that that never happens again. These are the kinds of things that should have been in the dialogue. These are the kinds of things that the members of the First Nations are wondering and wanting to know about. And the Liberal government is crickets because the Liberal government is only giving it lip service. But you and I here on the Canadian Shield, we are not giving it lip service. We are wanting to know how it's going to be fixed because we want this country to be the best on earth, the best it can possibly be. And I can tell you right now that you can, I don't mind a middle class lifestyle. I don't think too many people do, but I do mind dirty, poisoned water that could be cleaned up and fixed and given fresh fish and all the rest of that. I believe that many people listening to my voice would agree with me.
This afternoon, and this morning, I told government officials, especially the Prime Minister, I'm not so worried about the legislation. I have no concern over it. And the reason is this: that Shoal Cree Nation wants to demonstrate and also send a strong message to both levels of government, federal and provincial, that we never gave up our land, we never gave up our resources when we signed treaty. Our vision is basically taking back what is rightfully ours, and that's the land and the resources. It is time that Shoal Lake stand up along with Red Earth Cree Nation to take back what is rightfully ours and start benefiting from the resources that have been historically extracted out of our traditional territory. I don't mean to boast, but we do have a very significant amount of resources within our traditional territory, both renewable and as well as natural resources. We also have minerals within that traditional territory. We also have critical minerals within our territory.
So now I think we can see the theme. The theme is like, listen, we hear you've written this legislation. We don't care a single thing about that legislation. We have grievances and we have concerns that we need to have addressed. And I believe that cutting Mark Carney and the Liberal government out of the loop and just having the negotiations with the provincial governments and with the industry leaders will go much further to solving these problems. The Liberal government is only going to get in the way. They're only going to muck things up. The body of legislation, C5, gives Mark Carney veto power at any given time. Here we have a collection of First Nations between Manitoba and Alberta from the Cree First Nations who say that they are unhappy that the province can come in without their permission. They're saying that they're unhappy that people are making money while they don't get a nickel. But otherwise, we're willing to sit down and hammer out a deal that will solve this problem. And of course, I have been saying from the very beginning that all you got to do is take out your checkbook and include them in the process and everything will be fine. Obviously, contingency has to be made to clean up the water. And obviously, paying attention to not dirtying the water again is something that we have to pay attention to. It has to, and there is great technology and great industry already surrounding that. There are plenty of people that know that when they come back in and reclaim it or regreen it, that it looks exactly the way that it was. Keeping the water clean is step number one. Making sure the land don't get polluted is step number two. And then after that, everybody just comes back through and replants it and lets the wildlife come back, and that's it. And that's all, job done. So I believe that we can see that there's absolutely an envelope or room for development here. And we have a great opportunity. We have an opportunity to create wealth among, as you heard one of them say, the fourth world. Clearly, there is more to it than that. Clearly, having the will of the leadership of the bands is only the first step, a major hurdle, I'll grant you, but it's not the only hurdle. You know, as we look at it and we think these three provinces, and including the Yukon and the Northwest Territories and Nunavik, we can see that the federal government is irrelevant. We can see that only Bill C-69 is in the way of these kind of developments getting off the ground. We can understand that the federal government has now sort of superimposed themselves into jurisdictions that are not their domain. And they do so based on the idea that they've made a private investment from companies so difficult that they offer up tax dollars to help these projects go through. Of course, you and I understand that the Liberal government is not the problem solver, they're the problem creator. You and I understand that the best way to get shovels in the ground is to get the Liberal government and all of the regulations out of the way. Once you begin to build it, they will come. The prosperity will come, the investment will come. The roads and the railway, or the magnetic levitation, will all come. And if we take care of it properly right now, if we do it correctly from the get, we are talking about generational economic growth. We're talking about great-grandchildren looking back, having a decent life, saying, yeah, my grandfather, he worked to shovel, or my great-grandfather worked to shovel, and now 3 generations later, we have this great house and this great life and all blah, 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 all the things that you know and you've heard and you've read about and all the rest of that. We know that this system works. We know that the only thing right now that we have to address is the conversation between the First Nations and the provinces. And quite literally, the Liberal government has become irrelevant. Because this isn't a project that's running through Quebec and running into Halifax. This is a project that already has a coalition of the willing. And all we need to do is loop in the First Nations bands that it's touching. And while we do that, while we put through the magnetic levitation, while we put through the pipeline, well, let's just talk about what critical minerals you have available and how we, the province, can help you get a mining company up and running, or, lend you the money for the equipment so that you yourselves can operate the mine. We will give you all the technical know-how. You know what? We brought the internet with us on a hard line. It's not even on the satellite. So you'll be able to Google it anytime you want. In fact, we've set up a website, a database where we have industry leaders talking about what's the new and improved, and you can simply send them an email. That's the kind of thing that we need to do to make this country the country that it should be. Never mind the rest of the rhetoric and all that foolishness. We just need to talk about how we can get the economy up and running in a way that keeps the water clean, keeps the ground clean, and keeps everybody fed. The middle class is what matters, not the elitist of the Liberal Party, not the Marxist ideology of the central government control, none of that stuff. That's not the future for anybody in this country. That's not a bright future for anybody, period. I believe that what we see here is that Mark Carney, again, is not capable of negotiating. This isn't just against Donald Trump. He's just not a negotiator. That's not a skill that he possesses, because what he's used to doing is coming in with a bunch of money and manipulating the system that's in place. Negotiation is a hard thing. It takes skill. It takes awareness. It takes listening. I mean, there's a lot of things involved in this. But that we'll leave to the next video. I'm going to wrap here. I want to thank you for listening. Let me know what you think down in the comments. I'll talk to you next time.